Now, let's get to this morning's guest, who's sort of ending the speaker series, and we couldn't have picked a better choice in which to end the series with. We will be hearing today from Lloyd Shelton. Just a few facts about Lloyd is that prior to his coming here to Michigan, he worked in the Ann Arbor Public Schools for 8 years as a parapro. He is currently in the Ann Arbor City Commission, and he's a commissioner for disability issues. He is an MSW candidate in social policy evaluation here at the University of Michigan. He is the founder and president of Students with Disabilities in our Allies group, and he is he's also in the Social Work Student Union as a student representative. Now, those are the things that are all public and known. What I didn't know, that I just found out, is that he is also a poet. And that come November, he will be publishing a book of poems that you can all get online at lloydshelton.com. And that will be, Lloyd, any particular date in November?
Probably around November 25th.
Right, 25th. So after you're done with your turkeys, you're going to need a little poetry. lloydshelton.com.
Yeah.
Without further ado, Lloyd, let me at least talk about the title of today's talk is the Intersectionality and Disabilities. And after that, I'll turn it over to Lloyd. Thank you, Lloyd.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Stuart. Appreciate that. One thing I forgot to say also, or I forgot to tell Stuart, is I'm also a proud member of the E-Board of Students of Color of Rackham as a political activist chair. So I'm a very blessed man, very fortunate to be able to do a lot of things with not very much time. Unfortunately, today, in regard to time, I apologize for the lateness. It's just been a mountain, avalanche of technical difficulties, just this stream of just, oh, no, not this today, you know? So I apologize for your time. I appreciate everyone taking the time out. I know our lives are extremely busy. We all have a ton of things to do, and so for you to take the time to come here and hang out with me and to value what I bring to the table enough to do so is deeply, deeply appreciated. And so, and as we mentioned, technical difficulties, someone's grabbing my notes right now, and so I'm waiting for those to come back. But in the meantime, I just wanted to share, I was invited to write a blog recently about my experience as a graduate student here with a disability here at the University of Michigan. And it's been something that was I'm chewing it over in my mind, and I'm thinking about, you know, how do I start this? I always like to start things with the title. You know, I work backwards. I guess I start with the title, and then I fill in the blanks. And so, you know, I think about my experience here at the University of Michigan as a graduate student, and I think about the fact that, you know, a long time ago, about 5 years ago, I was riding past this university, and I was with my mother, and she said, I was telling her how I always wanted to go to U of M, but I went to Eastern because I felt that U of M was too big, too powerful, too intimidating, academics and so forth. And so my mother was like, well, you just go there as a grad student. And I was flattered that she thought that was a possibility. And so I didn't think she really knew what she was saying, though, because it's the University of Michigan, you know. And so here I am, right? A couple years later, my mom ended up passing away, but she had some prophecy going on, I guess. You know? So yeah, today I want to talk to you guys about something that's obviously very important to me, and that is intersectionality and disability, and what it means to be a person, basically, with a disability. Something I always talk to people about is the fact that, so I took a class this past summer about leading a dialogue as it relates to identity exploration, right? And we always talked about the different identities that we all have, and and we always talked about them in this singularity, as if you could talk about being a woman without what it means to be a Caucasian woman or African American woman, right? Or we talked about disability as if we could talk about disability in a vacuum, right? And we know that none of us have an identity that exists in a vacuum, that all of our identities kind of merge over and bleed over into other identities and are influenced by other identities. You know, I always say that we're all walking or rolling amalgamations of identities, right? With this big ball of identities. And so I can't talk about being a disabled person without talking about being a man. And I can't talk about being a man without talking about being an African American man, right? And so all these different identities all kind of bleed over into one another and kind of fold in together, and right? And so intersectionality approaches exploration of life through that prism, through that paradigm, or that framework of examining things in light of other things and understanding that things don't happen in a vacuum, right? And so I use myself as an example. I'm an African American man with a disability, right? So what's that mean? What are the implications of that? Just to name a few. I'm also a cisgender, so I'm a cisgendered man of African descent in America with a disability who grew up in a blue collar, middle class environment in the Midwest, right? And I can keep going, right? Like there's an endless number of identities that make me up as who I am. But as we try and explore any particular identity, it's difficult to do so without doing so in light of all the other components that make us up who we are. And so intersectionality approaches identity exploration through that framework. And so as an African American man, well, as an African American man, what's that mean to be an African American man? Right? I have to look into the historical context of African Americans in our history. What did it mean to be African American man historically at the time that I was born? What type of ethos existed within the culture and in the society that I was born into? What entails manhood? Period. Right? What's it mean to be a man in Ireland? May mean something very differently than what it means to be a man in Hawaii, right? And so what it means to be a man in America in 1970 when I was born, right? As an African American person during that time and that space when America was going through this transition, the civil rights movement and all the carryover from that, right? And so we look at that framework and say, okay, I'm an African American man. What does manhood mean in America? What does manhood mean in the African American community, right? And then we say, okay, well, what does manhood mean in disability? Well, what does disability mean in America, right? And what does disability mean in the African American context? And then what does manhood mean within disability, right? And so we see all these different intersections, right? That's where the term comes from, intersections. These things, these labels, these identities all overlap and influence one another. And so as I examine who I am this past summer, I found it very difficult to do so without understanding myself in my totality. And so the whole aspect of understanding intersectionality is to try and examine things in a more, I don't want to say totalitarian, that sounds different, in a more of a totalistic, I just made that word up. I'm a poet, I do that stuff, you know. In a more totalistic, see, if I say it with authority, people will believe me, framework, right, where we look at a person in their entirety. And so thank you again for coming, and I am not a PhD yet. I don't have a doctorate in front of my name yet. But so feel free, and even if I did, feel free to jump up. If you have questions, raise your hand. To my folks on the left, I can't see you as well, so you might have to scream a little bit. But I want this to be kind of interactive. I don't want this to be a long lecture. It's lunchtime. It's right before lunchtime, so our energy level is dropping, right? All right, so we're going to jump into it. Let's go to the next slide. It's my buddy Ben right here. Everybody say hi to Ben. That's my buddy. All right, so goals and objectives, right? I want us all to leave here, myself included, having learned some newer concepts and gained some understanding, right? I don't want us just to leave here saying we had a good time and Lloyd was a decent speaker, but I want us to leave out of here empowered more. And so speaking of empowerment, I am an activist. I'm an advocate. I'm an activist for people with disabilities. I'm an activist for African Americans. I'm an activist for people from the blue collar area and for people from lower socioeconomic areas. And so my goal is to always motivate. My goal is to always leave you out of here, you know, waving your pom-poms and on fire to try and impact the systems that are around us, right? To try and change the mechanisms that have been going on and trying to improve the world. We want to make the world a better place, right? So that's the goal. That's one of the main goals. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to be very transparent. Some of you I see in the room are very familiar with disability studies and disability culture, and so you guys know all about the different types of frameworks that disability can be examined through. I make no bones about it. I am fully embracing the social model of disability, which says that, which is kind of a political model, which says that basically that the disability is a construct, right, and that it's up to society to create itself, to frame itself, to express itself in a way that's inclusive of everyone, right? We don't want a society that's exclusive of women. We don't want a society that's exclusive of LGBT people. We don't want a society that's exclusive of people with disabilities. And so it's our duty to shape society in a way that's inclusive of all these identities. And that can go from everything from the culture that we're surrounded by, in terms of the type of language that people use as they refer to disability, right? And it also goes to the type of expectations that we see expressed in our school districts, the expectations we see expressed in our churches and our communities in general, right? But it also goes into the actual framework of the society that we live in, the physical environment. We need to make sure that our physical environment is shaped in such a way that there are door buttons for people to get in, and that the doors aren't too heavy for people to get inside the doors, and there are elevators and so forth. So there's multiple approaches to this aspect of making society more accessible for those of us with disabilities. And the social model says it's society's responsibility to do so. The society is not okay to say we're not going to put elevators. It's not okay to say we're not going to make buildings accessible. It's not okay to say we're not going to put any wheelchair accessible housing in our community. It's not okay. And so as society goes, we need to be advocates on behalf of inclusion. And inclusion also includes disability. All right, next slide, please. Okay, why is this important to me? So probably pretty obvious at this point. As an African-American man with a disability, I was born in Detroit, Michigan, long time ago. I was diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy, which is a type of muscular dystrophy. I was diagnosed probably around 5-ish years old, maybe 4. They had misdiagnosed me. So I have spinal muscular atrophy, which has several different manifestations, right? One manifestation, you live to about 10 years old, and you pass. Another manifestation, you live to about 60 years old. And then another manifestation doesn't onset until your late 30s. So since I was identified as having this at the... Hello? All right, there we go. Let's see, where was I? So yeah, I was born. I was diagnosed. So initially, about 2 years old, my mother recognized I wasn't as mobile as other children my age, or as mobile as I should have been. And she took me to the doctor. And at the doctor's office, they did some examinations and came back with, unfortunately, a misdiagnosis of me having the form of spinal muscular atrophy, which children past at about 10 years old. And so for the first 10 years of my life, my mother was expecting me to check out. And then about 13 years old, the doctors looked at me and said, well, oops. Think we dropped the ball on that one. He's still doing all right. And so obviously I grew up in Pontiac, Michigan, mainstream to fourth grade, and attended Eastern Michigan University. I'm a proud Eagle. Well, not Eagle. I'm an emo. I'll say I'm an emo. A proud graduate of Eastern Michigan University. I've lived independently. Been blessed to live independently for about 20 years at this point. So I'm extremely blessed, man. And so obviously things related to disability are very, very important to me. Of course, because of my identity, but having lived this experience, realizing that there aren't enough people. I'll say there aren't enough people out here advocating for disabilities' rights. There aren't enough people advocating for disability studies. And so this is something I'm very passionate about, among a lot of other things. And so intersectionality, right? This is a quote I came across. It says, it acknowledges, right, that we can have this kind of duality in our existence, right? That as we have different sectors of our identity, it's possible to be both an oppressed and oppressed, right? And so we look at a Caucasian woman, right? And so we say she could be oppressed as a woman because it's a patriarchal society. She can be marginalized. Her identity as a woman can be something that society views as a negative or as detrimental, and can be troublesome in terms of her success in life. However, as a Caucasian person, there are certain benefits and privileges that are associated with having that identity, right? And so it's this kind of push-pull type of thing that we see. So that it's not always, as we look at um, identities and we look at oppression and privilege, that I can't just say, well, I'm a man, I'm a black man with a disability, so I'm very oppressed. Okay, there's some oppression there. There's no doubt there's some marginalization that's taking place there. But as a man, right, I have certain freedoms that women may not have. As a man, I have certain privileges that women don't have. Let's be honest about it, right? However, in contrast, as a person with a disability, there are certain privileges that I don't have, right? And as a black man, as a person of African American descent, there's certain privileges that I don't have access to either, right? So it's this nuanced approach to identity exploration, this nuanced approach to how we function in life, and understanding that I always tell people that I'm always different. You know, I've grown to accept being different, and I love being different. I embrace it now. But of course, as a teenager, it was weird because we always want to conform. We always want to be in the pack of people like ourselves, right? But what I mean by that, I'm always different, is that usually, you know, as an event like this, where it's organized around disability, I'm usually the only African American man in the room, right? And then when I go to an event that's organized around issues related to race, issues related to blackness, I'm usually the only man in the room with a disability. And so I'm always a little different than everyone else, right? So that's, again, that has to do with that duality, that complexity of the complexity of identities, the complexity of who we are and how we move through different spaces, and understanding that, you know, I always think about the fact that, you know, someone asked me actually in the class last week, someone asked me, what was my most salient identity? And I had to step back and think about it. Like, I don't know, because it really depends on where I'm at, right? So if I'm in a room full of, for instance, sticking to the examples I just gave, if I'm in a room full of people organized around disability, then my most salient identity at that point is my blackness, right? Because I'm the only black man in the room, oftentimes the only black person in the room, but always, or 95% of the time, the only black man in the room, right? However, when I'm in an organization or in an event organized around race, um, around blackness, then usually my most salient identity at that moment, right, is my disability. And so it's like no matter where we go, it's our difference that usually pops up to the surface more readily. And so this whole fluidity of what identity is more prevalent in our mind, in our heart, at any given moment, is, I think, something that we should be mindful of and respectful of, and something that I'm grateful to have explored. So yeah, again, we can fight against one form of oppression while perpetuating others, right? And so I may say, you know, I want to fight for disabilities' rights, but then at the same time, I may be perpetuating some other type. Maybe I'm perpetuating the marginalization of women, right? And so, you know, I'm a man, and so it's a bunch of men sitting on stage talking about disability. And so, you know, I, as a disabled person, with our rough voices and our beards rubbing against the microphone, right? But if there's no women on the stage, then we're perpetuating what? Patriarchy, right? And we're marginalizing women. So it's important that as we explore different identities, we try and encapsulate as much diversity within those identities as we can. So as we talk about disability, we don't just want a bunch of men on stage. At the same time, we don't just want a bunch of African American men on stage. At the same point, we don't, right? So we want, you know, we want to have as many people represented at the table of discussion as possible, so that we get a fuller picture, a fuller portrayal of whatever identity it is that we're exploring every time we explore an identity. And this is at the crux of intersectionality, being very cognizant, very mindful of that as we talk about something, we need to look around the room and say, who's represented here? And if we don't have people represented in a room of a certain identity group, we need to make sure that we note that going forward, right? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of disability, how big is this population, right? because the main focus of this talk is disability and how disability intersects with other things. So, unfortunately, I don't have 10 hours to talk to you guys because I know you would love to listen to me talk for 10 hours, right? And so we're gonna narrow it down to just a couple identity intersections. And so, but the basis that we're looking at this from the standpoint of is disability. So, how does disability intersect with race? How does disability intersect with gender? How does disability intersect with SES, right? And so, those are going to be the approaches that we're going to explore going forward. So, with disability being the foundation of I guess the let me see here, the fulcrum. Let's say it's the fulcrum of what we're examining here, right? And so, how many disabled people are there in the United States? The Census Bureau said that there was about 53 million Americans with a disability, which includes all ages, and about 2/3 of these individuals have severe disability. So when we look at historically, what we find most statisticians will say is that there's usually about 20% of any given population that has a disability, right? Anywhere between 10 and 20. Some people say 15, some people say 20. So what does that mean? Does that mean that 2 out of every 10 people that we see in the diag either has a cane or is in a wheelchair or has crutches? Well, no, because many people with disabilities aren't necessarily readily identifiable by the eye, right? So a lot of hidden disabilities. There's a lot of people who have maybe learning disabilities or have different cognizant disabilities, excuse me, or maybe depression or other types of disabilities that you may not recognize as soon as you see them. However, these disabilities are still very tangible and very real to their lives, right? Next slide, please. And so, as we examine this disability, what's it mean to be disabled, right? Kind of looking back to a couple slides when I talked about the social model of disability. When we look at the words up here, we see incapacitated by illness or injury, excuse me, physically or mentally impaired, right? And so these are very substantially limited activity, especially in relation to employment or education, right? Yes. That's pretty intense. That's pretty intense. So what is old? What does that mean? Some people was you ask a 9-year-old, you ask one of my godsons who's 7 years old, what's old, and he'll say, somebody in their teens. He's 17. He's so old, right? You ask a teenager, he'll say, "Oh, 30 is just way over the hill, right?" And so you ask somebody in their 40s, and they'll say 80. So it's fluid. Again, it kind of goes back to how we define things, right? And which is kind of great. Kind of getting at the point where I was heading is that, the lens that we look at things through, right? So in some cultures, they admire people as they get older, because they see it as wisdom. It's like, wow, let me sit at your feet and let you explain to me some things about life, because I'm young and I'm trying to grow. But in American culture, we idolize and worship youth, right? Everybody is buying cosmetic products to try and this will make you look 5 years younger, or dye your hair and make your hair look so you look younger. Men are out here trying to chase our youth and so forth, and people to be encouraged to stay in the gym. And I'm not against being healthy and working out, but it's this idolization, this idolatry towards youth, as opposed to in other cultures where they admire folks being older because they admire wisdom. So there's a cultural aspect to this, right? How do we examine these things? But we know culture is fluid, right? We can impact culture. We can change culture. 100 years ago, I wouldn't have been in this building, flat out. Like there's no way I would have been in this building. Even my buddy Ben here, who's part Asian, he might have had a hard time getting in this building because we didn't fit the mold that society's culture at the point said is acceptable, it's safe even for me to be in this space, right? Even 60 years ago, there might have been some issues with me walking around this campus, And so we know culture can change. Culture is is malleable. It can be evolved. It can be developed, and especially if we're very intentional, which is why I think advocacy and activism are very important, because we can change society. We can shape society. Me being in this room, giving this talk in this building, is evidence that society can be changed, right? And so as we look at this disability or the term disabled, we see a lot of negatives implied, right? Illness, injury, incapacitated, substantial limitations, right? Because they're looking at disability through the lens of it being a negative thing. We're looking at disability through the lens of it being a weakness, right? Which is problematic to me as a man with a disability. What's that mean if I have a disability? Does that mean that I'm inferior? Does that mean that I'm weak? Does that mean that I'm limited? Is that what that means? Should I be here giving this talk? You know, am I too weak? Am I too limited to conceptualize ideas? Am I too weak? Am I too limited to attend the University of Michigan because I have a disability? I don't think that's the case. I don't think anybody in this room thinks that's the case, right? And so, but that's a shift, because going back in time, you know, and I talk about 100 years ago, me being here as an African-American man, well, 40 years ago as a person with disability, right? And especially as an African-American man with a disability, forget about it. It's not going to happen, right? And so there's these labels that we attach to these identities as being detrimental, right? Next slide, please. And so again, culture, right? What is culture? Again, in one of my classes, somebody asked, "What is culture?" And we, you know, it seems like such a no-brainer what culture is, and then we always pause, like, well, let me think about this. Like, I don't really know. I could shoot you some, you know, off the cup, off the top of my head thing, but when I examine what it does mean to have culture, what does culture itself mean? That's a very complex thing, because it means different things in different arenas, different disciplines. It means different things to different people in different parts of the world, right? And so one of the things that I like, one of the definitions that I really embrace about one of the definitions of culture that I really embrace has to do with making meaning, right? What does it mean? What does it mean? What does whatever that it is mean? And again, I'm getting real ethereal, I guess, right here. But there's a book right here by a man named Alfred Young, who's actually the chair of the sociology department here at the University of Michigan. He wrote that book called The Minds of Marginalized Black Men, Making Sense of Mobility. Culture has a lot to do with how we make sense. T.S. Eliot says, actually, Ben, can you flip forward one slide for me? One more. All right, yeah, I guess they didn't include that slide. Let's go back a couple slides, bro. T.S. Eliot said that essentially that culture is how we make meaning of our reality, right? And so what's it mean to be a woman, right? In one part of the world, it means something different. And how that manifests is culture, right? In some parts of the world, you have to cover yourself from head to toe. That's a part of their culture. And so being a woman means being covered, right? But in other parts of the world, being a woman does not mean having to be covered from head to toe, right? And so that's one of the ways that I make sense of the definition of culture. But looking at Professor Young, Dr. Young's talk about culture, he speaks of, there's a lot of great stuff. I highly advise everyone to check that book out. It's an amazing book. Whether you're intrigued by things related to marginalized black men or not, it's just a great book in terms of how we as people make sense of life, right? And so in his book, Dr. Young says of cultural sociology, he speaks of sociology. He says, here cultural analysis as it has extended far beyond mid-20th century preoccupations with norms and values in order to explore the social and political implications concerning the construction of meaning systems, right? And so we're going beyond values and norms, right? Because values and norms are really an output of meaning, right? Why don't you jump out the window? I have a value because I value not breaking my neck, right? Right. So there's a meaning there. There's a transition that has to occur in our mind. And so as we go forward, I want us to be cognizant of the fact that culture isn't this fixed, concrete thing, but that it's something that's very malleable, right? Very malleable and very valuable, right? Let's go to the next slide. This is something I always include in my slides when I talk about disability. It says, what is normal, right? Again, looking at culture, what is normal? Normal is something that we see in culture, right? Culture says, in some cultures, they say it's normal for a woman to be covered from head to toe whenever she walks in public. That's just the norm. That's just what women do. In some cultures, they say it's normal for a woman to avoid making eye contact with a man. It's just the norm, right? In American culture, 100 years ago, it was normal for African Americans to not vote. It was the norm. Why would you expect to vote? What's crazy about you? Why are you expecting to cast a ballot? What are you talking about voting? You don't vote, right? It was the norm, right? And so we see this transition between meaning, values, norms, culture, the framework, and normalcy, right? And so what does normal mean? And this book right here is an amazing book. I really highly advise it. Leonard J. Davis, and he talks a lot about disability, but the concepts that he talks about are really applicable across life, I think, in other arenas as well. Thank you. Let's go with the next slide. And so what is normal, right? We think about normal as just being a normal word, but the word normal and actually the concept of normalcy isn't as old as we assume it to be, right? So we look at 1840. Well, this is 2014. We know human beings have been on the earth for a long time. And so if something is, less than 200 years old, this concept of normalcy only is less than 200 years old, why don't we challenge it? Where did it come from? And how long has it been here? Obviously, we see how long it's been here, right? Before that, we had this ideal, the Greek mythological ideal, right, which was kind of a reference to gods, right? And so they believed that gods, they believed that there were gods and there were humans. And there was this kind of tension between gods and humans in that only the gods were ideal, the Adonises and so forth, right? That they were perfect in many ways, and that what they brought to the table in terms of their physicality and in terms of their intellect was perfect. But they viewed everyone else, the humans, as being to some degree, some manifestation of some degree of imperfection, right? And so, but then we saw this transition when French statistician Adolphe Quetelet, I'll say it with authority, people believe me, says if one seeks to establish in some way, right, the basis of social physics, right, it is he whom one should consider. And so what this was during this time in France, they wanted to try and create standards as we move towards industrialization, right? And so they wanted to be able to create, again, normalcy, right? And so the statistician said we'll measure Stewart's head, we'll measure Ben's head, we'll measure Dan's head, and then we'll come up with an aggregate norm. We'll come up with an average, right? And that average will be the norm. That's normal. And so if your head is bigger than that average, then your head is bigger than norm. And if your head is smaller than the average, your head is smaller than norm, right? And so they did this, all these just compiling measurements and data and trying to come up with these norms, right? And so where does someone with a disability fit into that, right? People now talk about the average height for an American man is 6 feet tall. That's a manifestation of this, right? And so the height of doorknobs, when you walk to a door, you don't even think about how high should the doorknob be. You just reach out and turn the handle and walk in or walk out, right? But if, for instance, if all of a sudden there was this switch in normalcy to where all of a sudden Shaquille O'Neal became the model for normalcy, right? All of a sudden, now Shaquille O'Neal is what, 7'2", 7'1", something like that. Close to over 300 pounds, incredibly strong, incredibly big, right? Well, if he became the new norm, then all of your feet would be swinging because your chairs would probably be about 5 inches higher, right? Your feet would be dangling like a second grader, right? And you have to reach up to turn the doorknob. And to push that door open, you have to probably have to put all of your physical weight behind it, right? Because all of the standards would be moved to the right, just that much. As we now, all of a sudden, when you get on the airplane, you feel inadequate. Now, all of a sudden, airplanes are twice as big, right? Has to grow to accept that new normalcy, right? And so, but how does that impact how we view disability? Well, take a guess, right? As a person with a disability, as a person who uses a wheelchair, steps are normal till if you can walk, right? And if we make society to these norms, then the ability to walk them down steps isn't a problem. But to a person like myself, not such a good idea, right? I need to get out of here at a certain point, so I need a ramp or an elevator so I can make my way back to where I have to go, right? And so you look at every disability out there, visual impairment, hearing loss, or hearing issues, right? We need to make sure society is shaped in such a way that this term of normalcy can be expanded to all human beings, to all those in the human family. Because as my friend pointed out a minute ago, the way we describe disability is the way many folks who get elder, as we get elderly, these things become a part of our reality, right? And so I always say that disability, air quotes, disability, air quotes, is actually a part of the human condition. If you get old enough, your eyesight will diminish, right? If you get old enough, your hearing will start to diminish. As you get old enough, you may have to have a hip replacement. So climbing up and down 12 steps may be more of a problem, right? As you get older, your strength may diminish, right? And so if you live long enough, I'm pretty sure at some point you will experience some type of disability, even regardless of not having any type of injury or anything like that. Just through the aging process, we experience the type of disability at some point in our lives, right? All right, so race. So we're going to look now real briefly as time is moving on. We're going to look at some of the identity intersections, right? So I'm going to look at race. I'm going to look at gender, and then we'll take a glance at socioeconomic status, right? Let's flip forward one time for me, Ben. All right, so some of the commonalities that we have with race, as we saw in the previous slide, the commonalities that we have with race have to do with how society views disability. Again, going back to that whole term of normalcy, right? So we talk about the normative, right? What's the normative narrative? In America, it's normative to be Caucasian. The culture, the mainstream culture in America has been based around Eurocentric standards and beliefs, right? And so normalcy in America in terms of culture has to do with being Caucasian. In terms of ableism, right, in terms of ability, the normalcy in America has to do with someone being an able-bodied person, right? And so we see two identities as we look at those with disabilities, as we look at those who are not Caucasian, as being somewhat marginalized to some degree, right? But as we look at race, kind of like as we looked at this whole concept of normalcy, the way we view race hasn't always existed. I know we tend to think that things have always been the way they are, and we think that things have just been that way forever. And so again, I'm trying to urge you to question things more in depth and to question why we accept some of the things that we accept, because they haven't always been that way. This term of normalcy hasn't always existed. It's less than 200 years old. And the way we view race, right, the categorization of people based on the way they look, hasn't always existed. It has not always existed. Of course, the people have always been different, right? That's just a part of life, and that's okay. At this point, we can say it's okay, right? Today, we can say it's okay. At this moment in time, in this room, we can say it's okay. Because if we go around the world, that may not be. In fact, as we go around campus, we may not find that to be the case, unfortunately, right? But this concept of race, this categorization, this Linnaeus, I guess I got to work on my my Latin here. Carolus Linnaeus, I guess. Sorry, Mr. Linnaeus, wherever you are, if I just butchered your name, right? Developed a system for sorting living organisms into major and then more specific categories, right? and then this other person, Johann Friedrich uh, Blumenbach, a German naturalist, took what he did and took it to a step further. But it wasn't instinct. It wasn't automatically applied to people, right? We always knew that there's been a gradient in terms of how much melanin one has in their skin. There's always been differences in terms of eye color and hair texture and so forth. But this firm, solid categorization of saying, okay, you belong in this category, you belong in that category, you belong in the other category, and then the attachment of prioritization to those in some categories, right? And then also the belief that folks who belong in one category, the attachment of detrimental characteristics to people who belong in certain categories, right? This is something that's happened recently, and we can look at Darwinian evolutionary theorem, and we can look at some of the work that these gentlemen right here did, as the attachment of the belief that because you belong to a certain racial or ethnic background, you are innately, inherently inferior, right? The belief that because you're an African American, you're really good in athletics, right? You're really great. You're really great at running. You're really great at throwing things. You're really great at physical activity, but intellectually, right? We don't know about you guys, right? That's something that hasn't always existed. And if we go back in history, we find plenty of evidence that completely undermines that theorem, right? The belief that, all Asians are good at math. You're Asian, of course you're good at math. You have to be good at math, right? But you see, because we see the inverse, right? So, in some groups, um, the attachment can be a negative attachment, a negative stereotype, right? And in some groups, the attachment can be a positive stereotype. And so this is how we see, again, culture, right? How do we make meaning out of life? How do we make meaning out of this whole concept of normalcy? And it hasn't always been that way. And we should question these things. We should challenge these things. We should be very, very intentional when we see things that are just put in our face as being normal, because this whole concept of normal should be normal. Next slide, please. Okay, well, actually, we're going to skip this one. Let's see where I don't want to take up everybody's time all day here. Okay, so disability and race. This is a great article I read where a lady, several folks did research where they looked at African American men and how African American men make sense of being disabled, right? And so what they did was they looked at, they went to a community, I believe it was in Chicago, and what they did was they examined how folks viewed being disabled, and they ended up going to a hospital where folks were doing rehabilitation. And many of the folks who were doing rehabilitation at that hospital, had been shot, ended up in this rehabilitation as a result of violent street crime, right? And so they wanted to look at how does the African American community make sense of disability, and does violence impact how they view disability? And what they found was extremely interesting. And I won't read it. I'll just kind of abbreviate it for you. But what they found was that in terms of folks who became disabled through nonviolent means, right? What they found is that folks like myself, like that, didn't actually see the disability as one of their main identities. That for them, the disability was just something else that happened, something else as a part of life. They usually saw their either socioeconomic status or they saw their race as their main identity, right? However, when they looked at folks who had become disabled through a violent incident, they found that actually they viewed their disability as much more salient to who they were as a person. And a lot of it had to do with how they dealt with, or how they were dealt with by the community. Because unfortunately, a lot of these gentlemen, and well, it was all gentlemen, had become disabled through violent crime as a result of gang activity. And so what they found was that after they had become disabled, they were often shunned by their street family, right? And so it was often difficult for them to find it back into society, back into where they had come from, because a lot of their identity was wrapped in, bravado and toughness and the ability to hold their own spot in the hierarchy of their relations, their circle of influence, right? And so all of a sudden now they're in a wheelchair, and so the things that used to define them, that was so much based on physicality at that point, were taken away from them in many ways. And so for them, their disability was a huge aspect of who they are. Of course, because it was also associated to the incidences that had taken place, and how it forced them to, at this point, re-identify who they were, or re-examine their prioritization and their hopeful outcomes in life. And in fact, something that was pretty profound to me was that in this community that they examined, for them, being disabled or being in a wheelchair was viewed as worse than being dead. So in this incident, being shot in a violent act, dying for them would have been a better outcome, a more honorable outcome than now being disabled, right? However, what they also found is that for people who had encountered violent situations like being shot, and who were able-bodied, who survived it and were still able to walk and live without a wheelchair, without severe disability, at that point it became a badge of honor, right? I got shot, 4 times and I'm still walking to tell about it. But then you're sitting on the bus next to a guy who got shot 4 times, is in a wheelchair, and you know another guy who got shot 4 times and is dead. And so the guy who got shot 4 times and is dead, he's viewed in an honorable light, like he died as a soldier and so forth, right? But the person who got shot 4 times and is walking and still very able-bodied is viewed as, a tough guy. He survived these things. So the person who got shot 4 times and who was now using the wheelchair, they don't know how to deal with that. Like, what does that mean? How do you make sense of this? And so, again, going back to what I talked about initially, as we examine disability, as I examine disability as an African-American man, what does it mean to be disabled? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be African-American? How do all these mechanisms push and pull against one another simultaneously in each particular moment of my day, and even at night as I sleep? Something interesting is, I always tell people, is that I've never had a dream where I was disabled. I've never had a dream where I was disabled. In every dream, I can always walk. And I need some. I know Courtney is a psych major, so I need to buy you coffee and help you get in my head and figure this out, because I don't know why that is. But I've never had a dream where I was disabled. And so, what does that say about the normalcy in my life? I even remember, probably about 10 years ago, talking to my mom. My mom had something on her mind. And she was like, "I saw your grandma today, and your grandma was saying how you don't act disabled." And my mom was trying to figure this out. Like, she was, I don't know what this means. And she brought it to me like I should just be able to just give it right back to her. Like, oh, well, Mom, what this actually means is grandmama is, and I had no idea how to deal with that myself, right? What does it mean to act disabled? But then I look at this generational thing, right? For my grandmother, being disabled had a certain framework to it, right? Restrictions, again, thank you. Because of the era that she grew up in. My grandmother was born in the 1930s, right? And so for her, seeing someone with a disability meant that they couldn't do X, Y, Z, and A, B, and C, right? And so here she sees her grandson going to college, living independently, dating, and all this other stuff. And so she's like, this doesn't make sense. Like, he doesn't act disabled, right? In her mind, I didn't fit the norm, right, for the culture in the time that she grew up in, for what a disabled person, how a disabled person is supposed to carry themselves, right? But again, culture has evolved. So for me, even when I dream, I don't dream as a person with a disability. I don't know what this means. That's a tangent. Just put that on the corner in the shelf somewhere and forget about it. And so, yeah. So again, going back to intersectionality, again, we're trying to figure out these nuances, that everything isn't just black and white, that everything isn't just cut and dry, that it isn't just a bunch of 90-degree angles. That there's always some kind of variance there. All right, next slide, please. And so now we look at disability and gender. And again, I won't read for you, but this is another great article I read among a bunch of others. This is one that really stood out to me by McDonald and Balazar. And really they looked at a lot of different quadrants of identity, a lot of different intersections of identity. And as it related to gender, what they found was that, actually, let me see if I can pull it out real quick here. Okay, so so in terms of gender, what they found is that for women with disabilities, they found that it was that they were often marginalized because the viewpoint, I can't seem to find it. The viewpoint for women was basically that the cultural expectations for women had to do with being a mother, right? Had to do with being keeping a home and so forth. Had to do with being an employee, and had to do with the unfortunate output of patriarchy is the sexualization of womanhood, right? That a part of being a woman is about being sexualized in a certain way, and I'm not in no way do I mean that women don't have the freedom to express themselves in any way they feel drawn to do so. But what I mean is that the expectations on women that we see in the media to present themselves in a very sexualized manner, and often to find their value in their sexuality and their ability to catch a man's eye, or their ability to dress provocatively and for people to say, oh, she looks hot, right? And all of that. And so as a woman with a disability who may not necessarily be able to fit those same physical aesthetics, right? They found that women with disabilities were often marginalized and desexualized, right? Looked as asexual, that you can't really be viewed as a sexual being because you're a woman, right? And how that affected them, the ability to be in our culture, in our society, attraction for a woman a lot of times is attached to sexuality, right? And so being attractive has to do with, again, we're going back to this whole thing of worshiping youth, right? Has to do with looking a certain way, the way the magazines present womanhood. And so as a woman with a disability, they found that women with disabilities not have the ability to present those same aesthetics was very troublesome to their self-esteem, to their sense of self-worth, which says a lot about a lot of different things, and that they were viewed as being marginalized because of their inability to be viewed in that light, and devalued because people figured that they weren't mother material, right? That they weren't employable. Like, how are you going to be, the 9-to-5 Wonder Woman, holding down a family with a soccer mom and a CEO if you have a disability, right? And so self-image was a big issue for women with disabilities. Likewise, for men with disabilities, it says men with disabilities may be perceived as incomplete men, right? As an incomplete man. Their failure to live up to the assumption of masculinity as capable, as strong, right? Physically, right? And so as an African American man, manhood, in the African American context, manhood is defined and reliant in many ways strongly on physicalities, right? So your ability to be a big, strong man. Again, we go back to the whole aesthetic of athleticism, right? That being a black man means being big and being physically imposing and tough, especially when you add the components of inner city life and having to make your way through tough environments around other tough people where hierarchy is there. And so as an African American man who's not going to be a big tough guy, who's not going to be recruited as an athlete, right? How do I make sense of my manhood, right? And then you think about the hypersexualization of manhood, right? That as a black man, it's expected that we're supposed to have a lot of women and so forth, and the culture that's associated with that. And so how does that play into the identity that disabled men have? How does that play into their sense of masculinity. And then this is an American thing. This isn't just African Americans. You know, in American, the sex machine isn't just a black guy. He's every guy, right? And so, what does that look like? How do you define your own masculinity or femininity when you can't fit into the aesthetics that media consistently pushes forth to define these identities? And so what we find is that people are often marginalized in terms of their masculinity and femininity. Next slide, please. Social economics. And so I'll be real brief. I can get right to the point with this one. Every study that you look at will tell you that there's a strong correlation between poverty and disability. Again, every study that I've seen, from the World Health Organization to a number of peer-reviewed academic papers, shows that there's a heightened correlation between disability and poverty, right? And what they normally attribute that to is that, number one, it's harder to get employed when you have a disability, right? And so lack of employment means that you're going to be poor, obviously, right? But also in terms of even before a person is age eligible to enter into the job market, what we often find is that because of the heightened cost of having a disabled child, right? There may be heightened costs in terms of healthcare, heightened costs in terms of physical medical equipment, right? As well as the heightened cost of maybe personal care, right? All of these impact the family's finances much greater. Also, there's a heightened correlation between poverty and disability, because being poor increases the likelihood of you becoming disabled, right? Because of the physical environments that you maybe won't be around, like increased pollution in the environment that we find in more lower socioeconomic environments. There's always more pollution, right? Also, environmental hazards. We talked about a moment ago of, violent events occurring that could lead to you losing a limb or losing the ability to walk or so forth, right? And so, and also less, I'll just say it, insufficient health care for those who are in poverty, right? And so things that, you might be able, if you go to the doctor every 3 months, maybe the doc catches it, after it's been there for a month. But if you go into the doctor every year or every other year or right, then something has more time to develop. And so by the time the doctors catch it, it may be too far along for them to stop it at an earlier stage. And so the implications of the health system and how the negative impacts that being poor has on your health, access to health care, also increases the likelihood of you becoming impoverished, right? So there's a number of intersections between poverty and disability. And so, yeah, it's 11:30. I know many of you may have to go, so I'm gonna wrap it up there. I'm just wondering if there are any questions. Anybody have any thoughts or ideas? Anna.
I have a thought when you mentioned the remark that your grandmother made. It just seems to me that, you were such an advocate and you were so active that you do not fit the stereotype of someone who has a disability. It seems very obvious to me that, I see you and I just see a tremendous activist advocate. And I'm thinking maybe your grandmother felt the same way.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Anna. Appreciate that. Yeah, but I think that so I challenge that a little bit, Anna, completely respectfully, and it's out of love, that. But I challenge that because there's this theory of the super cripple, right? The super cripple is something that the super crip, right? The super cripple, the person that is the disabled person that's amazing and they do all this crazy stuff and they're become this kind of hero type vibe, and I kind of push back on that, and I think about even in other movements, right? It's there's always some big mouth dude like myself running his mouth and screaming and yelling and giving talks and stuff like that, but everybody can be an advocate, as you know. So I'm not telling you anything new. Everybody can be an advocate. Everybody can be an activist. but
No.
but we should be though. But we all should be. Yeah, I completely understand. But I think we all should be. You know, and it's like I said, one of the things I want as folks leave this, I want you to feel empowered. I want you to feel, don't feel like, well, Lloyd's the activist for disability. So I'll just talk to Lloyd and say, Lloyd, you know, you should do this. And Lloyd, we really like you. No, I'm only one dude, and I'm tired, and I'm old, and I can't do everything. You know what I'm saying? I need to sleep. I got to get rest. So we got to work on this as a team. You know what I mean? Everybody has to get involved. Everybody's got to pick up a shovel. Everybody's got to grab an axe or a pick. We got to get this thing done together, no matter what it is, whether it's disability or women's rights, LGBTQ, African American, whatever the issue is. We have to work collectively as a society, and the crux of our passion has to be based on the value that we see in every human being. Like that's my whole thing is I see value in every person. You know what I mean? And there's a spirituality. My spirituality plays a huge part in how I view people, right? I see us all as being whether you have an IQ of 170 or IQ of 17, you have value, you have worth. Period. And so I embrace the social model because it says society figure it out. Period. Everybody deserves the ability to maximize whatever they have. Everybody figure it out. Get a handle on that. Get a button in front of that door. Get a ramp in front of that building. Get an elevator in that door. Get some large print in the building. Right. All right. We need to address our hiring policy. Right. Like let's get it done. It's our job. We make up society. Society isn't this brick in the middle of the diag. I'm society. You're society. We're society. And so we can change society. Again, I said 100 years ago, I wouldn't be in this room. Period. As a person with a disability, as a black man, I would not be sitting here talking to you. Our relationship and 100 years ago would be completely different, you know? But because society has changed, and it took blood, it took sweat, it took tears, it took people laying down their lives for me to be in this room right here. And so some of those people are in history books, but some of those people are in graveyards somewhere that we'll never know about. But it was standing up and saying, something is wrong, and I'm going to do something about it. Whether I'm famous or I'm infamous, whether I'm the president of the University of Michigan or I'm just some homeless dude doing whatever I'm doing today. If I see something that's wrong, if I see injustice, it's my duty, it's my obligation to stand up and do something about it. And no matter what that takes, something needs to affect it. And so I'm the big face guy in the front, but and I don't have to be that. I don't have to be the guy always talking. You know what I mean? But at this point, I am. But I want to see more. I want to see Megan up here doing the talk. You know what I'm saying? I want to see Ben doing the talk. I want to see Anna doing the talk. I want to see Patricia doing the talk. I want to see everybody. We all need to grab a pick, grab a shovel, and get busy. Carol.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. And what I wanted to say was, I've worked with adults with disabilities for 45 years. I can't believe I can say that now, but it is 45 years in mostly, almost exclusively an employment situation. And I've always seen the person before me, but I want to thank you so much for your presentation today, because when it comes to intersectionality, I think the history of the movement of disability access and rights in this country, this is where we need to be. Now we need to be looking at a deeper dive in terms of the complete holistic person before me.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate, and I hope you stay and get your PhD going so you can teach someday.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, we all have so many identities, you know, and we can't just draw these lines and say my blackness ends here, my disability begins there. You know what I mean? Like you can't say, you know, your womanness ends at a certain point and your identity as an American takes over at that point. They merge together, you know what I'm saying? And so, and then again, it goes, we need to go deeper and see the value of people just as people, you know, and say, you matter, period. And so your identity as X, Y, Z, A, B, C is awesome. Let's celebrate all of that. Let's open up doors so that you can explore and feel empowered and feel valuable and feel purposeful and be able to maximize all the gifts that you have in every aspect of who you are. And let's not say, well, because you're a woman, you can't do this. That's bullcrap. No, that does not work. You can't say because I'm a man I can't do this. So why can't I say because you're a woman you can't do that? We need to address all these things. And so it's for me, disability is a part of it, but really it's about a bigger movement of just trying to change the whole thing so people can be valued and manifest the gifts that they have. Period. Yes.
Thanks so much for that. I can see why you're an activist because I definitely feel motivated. But so kind of on the intersectionality question, I was wondering if you could just expand a little on what you said. I really liked what you said about when you're trying to do some kind of work or make some kind of decision, look around, see who's represented in the room and see who's not represented and be mindful of that. And I was wondering if you could say more about, so then once you have recognized that that's happened, and it happens for a lot of reasons, like, here at the university, or sometimes there's underrepresentation, and the same people are overworked because they're going to all the meetings, and so they're not going to be at your meetings, or maybe there's division of labor, and so there are certain groups that are just not showing up there. So is it that you should try to take on that perspective and see what would happen? Is it that you should find some way to consult somebody about it later, or I'm just thinking kind of what sort of concrete things would you recommend when you've come to that realization?
So I think you guys can hear me. I'm not going to use the microphone right now, so I can look her in the eyes and talk. So I have a friend who was attending a planted church in Cincinnati, and he felt led to plant a church that really was reflective of society in general. So he wanted a church that had people of all different socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnic, racial, everything. He wanted everybody in this church, right? And so he consulted with me and tried to get me to move down. I couldn't do it at the time, but and so he was like, how do I do this? And one of the problems that he found, and still finding, is that it's about our circles, right? We all have our social circles. Right? And so, how diverse is my social circle? How many people do I have who I call, who I talk to on a weekly basis, who look only like me? Right? How many people who I have in my network of friends, of family, of close people that I care deeply about, who are only just like me, who only listen to the same music I listen to, go to the same type of school I go to, study the same things I study, dress the same way I dress, right? So how much diversity do I have in my own personal life is a way to start, you know what I mean? And really being intentional about breaking those boundaries down. I'm blessed to have friends from all over the world, all over the country, all different backgrounds. And that's an extreme blessing to me. I learned so much from people who are different than me. And I don't just mean, what's your food like? What kind of, you guys use chopsticks? You guys, no, I don't mean stuff like that. I mean like, how do you think about life? How do you process life? What's your relationship with your parents like? How does that work in your family and your culture? Is that normative in your culture, right? Like, and just having all of that, having those deeper discussions and being very curious in my own life, in my own mind and heart about how people operate and how I can learn from people. And so that's the way we started on a very personal level. But then when we get to a classroom, when we get to a board meeting, and we're looking around the room and we're like, wow. Or we're putting a panel together, a panel discussion together, and we say, okay, right, we come to that realization, that moment where everybody here looks alike, everybody here has the same political view, everybody here is the same in some way, shape, or form. Right? I think as a society, let me be a little political here. As a society, we are so polarized. Politically, culturally, socially, just polarized to where I want to be around Democrats, or I don't want to be around Republicans, or I don't want to be around people who listen to hip hop, or I don't want to be around people who listen to rock and roll, right? And we stick to our cliques. We find our tribe and we just stay in our tribe and we just, we get involved in this cognitive dissonance where we only listen to people who are talking about the stuff that we want to talk about the way we want to talk about it, And so it's bigger, it's a lot, it's bigger than just it's societal, you know what I mean? And so anytime we want to change things about society, you have to be extremely intentional. And so, you know, a lot of it has to do with getting outside of our comfort zones, you know, and intentionally engaging in spaces that we don't normally go to, you know what I mean? I went to a predominantly Asian church. And I don't just say it's because you're Asian, I just say it because I went to a predominantly Asian church. But, and it was awkward. It was very awkward. There were moments that were amazing, you know. Dan's one of my best friends. We met at that church. And so there are people that I love deeply that grew out of that relationship. But sometimes it was just hellacious, like just uncomfortable. And maybe some of it was just that particular church. But I think a lot of it was just, I'm different than everybody else in the room. You know what I mean? And so we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. In social work, we talk a lot about leaning into the discomfort, you know, which is counterintuitive as people. You know, when something's uncomfortable, I don't want to do it again. I don't want to go back to that church. I don't want to be around those people that are so different than me. I don't want to engage in this conversation with someone who doesn't have much in common with me, right? Because it's uncomfortable. So that was awkward. Now let's not do it again. Where in actuality, if we really want to get out of our comfort zones, we have to be intentional about just doing just that, you know what I mean? And so whether it's a board meeting, whether it's church, whatever it is, you know, get out of our comfort zone and engage with people who are different than ourselves. But I think you talked about something, you mentioned something very great, or very, very powerful. You talked about the lack of diversity in institutions like the University of Michigan, right? As a black man, 4.8%, it's terrible. And so, you know, we say, well, you know, is that a black problem? You know, is it just that black people are missing out on getting this education? I think it's a university problem, right? Because one of the blessings of diversity is having people who are different than you, who see things different than you, who process things different than you, who come out with different outcomes that you will normally come up with. And so eventually the product, whatever that product is, whether it's a bottle design or a microphone design, or whether it's a culture, right? If we look at, that's good, I like that. If we look at culture as a product that we create, right, then having diversity improves that product, you know? And so the 4.8% enrollment of African Americans, it's not just an African American problem, it's a university problem. And so when we had BBUM last year, I don't know how many of you folks know about BBUM, but when we have, you know, protests about women's rights, as a man, I should be there too, right? That protest about the 4.8%, it shouldn't just be African Americans on the diag, it should be everybody on the diag, because you're missing out on something too. Your culture in this university is being adversely affected by a lack of contribution of African Americans. When there's an issue about disability, it shouldn't just be a bunch of disabled people in the room. There should be plenty of people who are allies. That's the whole point of alliances and allyship, right? That we should try and see culture as an outcome. You got to be turned up. Talk about something that's real big to me, you know. So, but thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, any other thoughts or questions?
Before you leave, just a couple of other remarks. One is, Lloyd, thank you. We have some tokens of appreciation, so I'm going to put that in your backpack. A couple other things. The PowerPoint, and I know there's some slides that we had to skip due to time. The PowerPoint and the notes that Lloyd has, as long as I have his permission, will be put on the SSD website, so you can access those. That might take a few days to do, I'm assuming Mary, who's our webmaster. But it will be available on the SSD website. Additionally, please take a flyer. Come next month. We'd love to have you. Tell friends, family, as wide a diversity as we can possibly have. We'd be more than willing to do that and happy to do it. Lastly, there's still lots of fruit back there. Please take some and pass that out to friends and family as well. So thank you for coming. I hope to see you next month. And if you have any questions, we'll be hanging around for a minute.
Thank you.